Welcome, everyone, to Kremlin File. Today, we have with us retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and he was former Director of European Affairs at the National Security Council, and as Foreign Area Officer. He also served in embassies in Kyiv and in Moscow, I think in Kyiv for 1 year, in Moscow for 3, and then also as a political military affairs officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And lastly, up until 2018, he was also on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. He's author of Here, Right Matters, An American Story.
Yes.
If anybody hasn't read this book yet, absolutely fabulous.
Thank you for coming on.
Yes, it's a real delight for us.
Thanks for having me on.
There's something that you and Olga have in common. You're both from Brighton Beach, right?
Yes, we both came same wave.
Your entire family, correct, is Ukrainian.
It is. It's a Jewish Ukrainian family for well over 100 years or so. I was born in Kiev. My father was born in Kiev. I think my mother also. I know my mother was also born in Kiev.
And how were you living that period? Let's say coming up to the renewed aggression, against Ukraine, and then afterwards, how did you take that?
Before this war started, I wrote, appeared on cable news talking about this. Wrote an article in the New York Times saying this war is all but certain, and we needed to do more to avoid it. At least try to avoid it. Like I said, it was all but certain, but we should have at least tried to. We should have, done a number of different things to warn off Russia, indicate the cost would be high. And then once, by the time we get into January, I wrote a long piece for Foreign Affairs, basically laying out what the Russians were going to do in detail. Like, the fact that they were going to go for maximalist aims, the fact that they were going to attack from all these directions on the hopes of, a quick fait accompli scenario, turned out to be pretty darn accurate. And that it was going to develop into a longer war with increasing risks for the U.S. And just talking extensively about how, as the longer this war goes on, the more dangerous it gets for the U.S. as Russia attempts to kind of find a way out of it. So unless Ukraine wins relatively quickly in the next several weeks, because Russia's a spent force, Russia's going all in with this offensive in the east, unless Ukraine wins decisively and proves to Russia that they cannot sustain this war, there is a risk of general mobilization, and there's a risk of the U.S. being dragged into this war as it extends for months, maybe even years. But that's on kind of one intellectual level. I'm a military officer. I'm a strategist. On another level, I feel a deep sense of pride for our my birthland, and how well that they've performed. The fact that they are taking the brunt of the defense of democracy in the democratic world. And I feel a deep sense of pride, something that I frankly didn't feel for Ukraine, because I was raised in the United States. I came over when I was 4 years old. I only know America. I served in Ukraine for a year. I served in Moscow for 3 years, but it was kind of more conceptual. I went back there to visit my family's grave sites when I went there on official travel or something of that nature. But now I feel it, and I feel, a deep sense of pride here. In my case, I mean, I'm also, a Jewish Ukrainian man, like being well represented by Volodymyr Zelensky. So, quite in demand right now.
People looking at it from outside, in the sense that we're not Ukrainian, it's also a battle for values that over the years we've seen eroded.
Well, that's what the special magical thing about Ukraine is, it's not about leadership. It's about the people. I mean, it goes from bottom up, and you see here, everyone, risking their own lives in order to fight for their land. And that's, whereas in other countries, more in the West, it's always more, you look to the government to save you and to institutions. And there, it's like, after Yanukovych, people are like, we have to be on top of this,
I think it is, in fact, a story of the people and civil society that helped kind of usher in this Western orientation. But I don't think you could discount institutions.
Yeah,
The
no,
military has
absolutely.
made major strides. I think Zelensky, at certain times deserved the criticism he received for not living up to kind of his own expectations of himself, being subject to entrenched interests that seemed impossible, in peacetime, but now are kind of easy compared to the existential threat, and he's really risen to the occasion.
Mhm.
And I think there's something definitely to be said about the fact that yes, the Ukrainians are fighting for their homes, but they're also fighting for it's an ideological struggle for freedoms.
Yeah.
And for many Americans, these are academic, these are conceptual, these are theoretical. What does democracy mean? What does the fight for freedom mean? And we don't have to speculate about that anymore. We just turn on our TVs
Yeah,
on every
and there it
channel.
is.
We see
Yep.
Ukrainians fighting for these freedoms, for our freedoms. I think there's a recognition that they're fighting for
Mm-hmm.
our freedoms, and they're
Mm-hmm.
fighting for kind of the soul, the direction of the 21st century. And that's why Ukraine enjoys such support. Especially if somebody some of the work of framing the struggle in the right way, the message really, really resonates. And for too long, I don't think we had that. I think this administration, did a bit of an injustice in failing to kind of couch this war as a war for the 21st century. Now it's a little bit clearer,
Mm-hmm.
what the stakes are.
We saw at the beginning Russia, maybe over the first few days after they launched this assault, started making some gains. So what was the pivotal moment for Ukraine's military?
The pivotal moments were before this war started, frankly, in a lot of
Mm.
ways. Probably the most important moment was somewhere, historians will track this down, a conversation between Putin and Shoigu, Putin and Gerasimov,
Mm.
in which he framed his expectations for this war. In the military, we use the term assumptions, and the criteria for assumptions is that they have to be valid and necessary. And in this case, the assumptions that drove the battle plan were Russian chauvinism, Russian expectations that the little Russians, as the Russians
Mm.
call Ukraine, would surrender, would not defend their country, would accept a puppet regime, and that this would be easy. And those assumptions were absolutely essential to driving the initial battle plan, and a battle plan that had the Russians attempting to seize an airfield unsupported
Mm.
to the north and west of Kiev, to rush towards cities with expectations that and just encircling the cities, the Ukrainian regime would just give up. In fact, those assumptions, spelled disaster for the Russians. It just shows kind of the importance of these, like, these framing moments for a big, huge plan like this. Uh, the Ukrainians, in a way, stumbled into some success. I think that there was from the get go, the Russians, if the Ukrainians were going to resist, the Russians were never going to be able to achieve their goals. But there was another moment here. The Ukrainians also didn't believe that the Russians were actually going to attack, and therefore they didn't defend at the border. And not defending at the border allowed the Russians to make deep penetrations
Mm.
into Ukraine and get all the way to Kiev, get all the way, almost encircle Kharkiv, Chernihiv,
Mm-hmm.
fight all the way out to Kherson. These are long stretches. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and these are long stretches of road, hundreds of kilometers in certain cases. And what ended up happening is it was kind of almost stumbling into some success here, because when they did get to these cities, the Ukrainians started to pound them, started to
Mm.
basically block them from entering the cities, started to pound them. And then when the Russians called for resupply of fuel, because you burn through enormous amounts of fuel, you only carry with you, a day or two of fuel,
Mm-hmm.
up to 72 hours of fuel on your tanks and armored personnel carriers and your trucks traveling, alongside of you. When they burn through their ammunition as they're fighting a fierce defense, they're calling for resupply. So as well as being punished at the point of those battles, Ukrainians are wreaking havoc on those front lines with javelins and anti-armor capabilities, and just really well executed ambushes. When these resupply convoys, these logistics tails started to roll through these hundreds of kilometers of unsecured space, they were obliterated. And those frontline units, unsupported, without these sustainment, without fuel resupplies, ran out of fuel, ran out of ammunition, and were either abandoned or destroyed.
Wow.
And that was a just catastrophic loss for Russia. I remember somewhere about day 4 or day 5, watching this, and fortunately the Russians didn't listen to me, but providing some commentary about the smartest thing that they could have done was basically to kind of retrograde back to the borders, where they had the supply lines, secure supply lines, and slowly making progress the way they're trying to do in the east. And in so doing, securing their logistics, moving up slowly, not giving the Ukrainians an opportunity to kind of destroy vulnerable units. It took them about 4 or 5 weeks to get to that point, to realize that that's what they need to do, and they went with a much more narrow campaign. But even now, the Ukrainians have proven themselves to be very, very tactically effective and operationally effective. Those are two different echelons of. So tactical would be like the ambushes.
Yeah.
Operational is this concept of the Ukrainians is now running a defensive in depth. So it's they have defensive positions staggered back. If the Russians overtake one, there are more defensive positions, but they're also mobile defenses, meaning that they're not going to stay and fight and die. Because the Russians' actually only means to victory is by destroying Ukrainian units. They could only win this war if they could defeat the Ukrainian military on the battlefield. Because holding the amount of ground that they want to take, even in the east, 900 kilometers, is impossible for the amount of force they have. So by the Ukrainians having these, being successful operationally and kind of just punishing the Russians with their creeping advance, the Russians have no real means to succeed, actually. And I think they're about to be spent as a force on the ground. They still have the air power. They still have these rockets that they could fire from across the Russian border. That might give the perceptions to Putin that he could sustain this war, continue to punish the Ukrainians, and that's where I've been most critical about the U.S. support, is that we've not given the Ukrainians the tools they need to win this war decisively and close off perspectives on theories of victory for Vladimir Putin.
Do you see the policy?
Okay.
Do you see the policy of U.S. now being more serious? Because over the past few weeks, I mean, there have been announcements of heavy weapons being sent. Do you see now going forward that we are more invested in making sure that Ukraine succeeds?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think that's clear to me. But there are decades of policy inertia that warn against Russia being defeated too soundly, and fears of Russian balkanization if it fails, or theories, kind of academic theories of mutual weakness for both parties to facilitate negotiations. These things are still arresting the kind of full-throated support. The rhetoric around moving heaven and earth to allow Ukraine to win. That's still unfortunately aspirational. We're moving there. I feel like the rhetoric around this being a long war in certain ways undermines providing Ukraine kind of full-throated support. The theory initially was that Ukraine was going to be crushed, and there was no point in supplying Ukraine initially. It was a very defeatist attitude. We've swung the pendulum swung too far over to the other side of protracted war, which allows us to kind of slowly meter in equipment instead of flood Ukraine with the equipment they need, including the high-tech equipment that allows them to strike targets, not deep inside Russia, but relevant military targets across the border, like airfields in Crimea and stuff like that. We're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction. I now balance my criticism with some praise for movement in the right direction, but we have more to do. War is unpredictable. It's possible that that the Russians would be so successful that they would potentially crush Ukrainian morale and will to resist, even if they didn't have all the forces. They had on paper, they had the high-tech forces, the operational concepts of using air power to go after critical targets, destroying Ukrainians' air defense systems to be able to fly, unfettered, or the Air Force to destroying the Ukrainian Air Force so they couldn't punish Ukrainian ground units maneuvering in. Those were concerns. Those were things that it seemed like Russia should have been able to do. But it became clear to me by about kind of, when I got a little bit more rest and saw that the Ukrainians were holding out, I did the math, the military math, to understand that the Russians came in with about 120, 127 battalion tactical groups, battalion-sized units. And when I did the math to figure out what they were trying to do around Kiev, it turned out that they would need about 120 of those to encircle Kiev. You have to have both kind of what's called an inner cordon and outer cordon, an inner perimeter to prevent the folks from inside the city from breaking out, and an outer cordon to protect the anybody from reinforcing it or breaking through resupplying. So almost the entire force that the Russians had assembled would have to be positioned to seize Kiev. Instead, they were fighting on four different axes, and at that point, it was I concluded that the Russians just wouldn't be able to do this, and the Russians would ultimately have to go for much more narrow objectives. And there, I was a little bit concerned that on more narrow objectives that they would be successful. But again, doing the math, math is useful, okay, even in the military. Doing the math on what the Russians had assembled in the east now, they've lost a huge amount of their units, somewhere between 75 and 93 battalion tactical groups. If you do the military math and you kind of stack those end to end, they could cover about 90 kilometers. Instead, they're fighting across 900 kilometers. So when they try to they shift from this offensive to defense because they can't destroy the Ukrainian units. The Ukrainians are just running these sophisticated, mobile defenses in depth and stuff like that. When they try to shift to defense, they'll be completely porous. And the Ukrainians will be able to infiltrate behind their lines and just pound away at them. So the Russians, even though the hold that they have now there is untenable, they're going to have to go for something much smaller. I imagine as reluctant as they're going to be, they're going to have to fall back in certain areas and just hold much more limited gains. Otherwise, they'll just get their military demolished over time. So I have pretty, I've got little doubt that the Ukrainians are going to be successful in this phase, especially with weapons pouring in from the West, replenishing, not, on one hand, replenishing the losses that the Ukrainians have taken. They've taken some losses. The Russians have taken disproportionately higher losses. The Ukrainians have taken some losses, but also gaining advanced equipment now. They're gaining some pretty good stuff. And the Russians have burned through a lot of their best equipment, and they burned through a lot of their best forces. So, the balance on the ground is definitely shifted in favor of Ukraine at this point. Once we plug this hole, hopefully sooner than later, with regards to long-range fires that I've been calling for, with these long-range rocket systems that we should be providing, these HIMARS, these wheeled cannon systems and stuff like that, and unmanned combat aerial vehicles, and take our foot off the brake on transferring aircraft. Once we do that, I think that it just makes it untenable for Russia to kind of sustain this war.
So we know Russia has been preparing for this strategy for a long time. I mean, honestly, I remember in 2009, when they had the strategy of eventually what we saw in 2014 to cut Ukraine, take the east, the south, and cut Ukraine off from the ports and kind of just, carve Ukraine out. Do you think that, I mean, so for one decade, they have been preparing for this. They attempted it in 2014, made some gains by annexing Crimea and occupying Donbass, but they didn't, they failed in Odessa, they failed in Kharkiv, and they failed in, the other cities they attempted to take over then. So then they, kind of stayed with what they have. Do you think partly that they sent not enough forces, because now we go into more of Russia's other thing of using influence operations, and we saw how they used influence operations inside of U.S. and how much damage it did. Do you think they were counting of having people that they have cultivated over the decades, basically since Ukraine became independent, and and going forward over the past few decades, to help grab power in cities, and then they were maybe counting on the forces to kind of more of like reinforcement?
So I think you mean like in the opening phases before things started to unfold on the ground. I think they were counting on a fifth column. They were counting on their agents to come through. It's interesting. I think the SBU has been pretty good at rooting out these folks steadily. I think there was an element of preservation from the kind of agentura, all these assets that were in Ukraine, pro-Russian parties. That if Russia was successful in those first several days, these people would be coming out of the woodwork to try to kind of seize power. But because Russia has in fact been so terribly unsuccessful, I think these people are in a lot of ways, they've either cast off visions of enriching themselves with kind of a Russian annexed territory, meaning that some of this is probably a recognition of their misplaced allegiance, that Russia is kind of barbaric. They're destroying the cities. Russia is not. Some of them very well may have bought into the kind of ideological perspective that we're ethnic Russians. Our home might be with Russia. I think a lot of those people in the East kind of cast that off based on how Russia's behaved, because they haven't had to live under a Russian regime since 1991. And they had some misplaced notions of how things would work out. And I think others have been, just simply pragmatic, that there was no path to success, and have either, silenced their support or hiding, concealing themselves because they fear the SBU is going to discover who they are. But this is a sea change. This is, now there is no possibility of a kind of pro-Russian faction emerging based on the way this war is unfolded. I think that's dead, and Russia may try to claw back some gains after this war over a long time. Enriching people, doing this kind of standard fare of soliciting agents through bribes and things of that nature. Ideologically, I find it's going to be nearly impossible for them to gain agents through some sort of ideological affinity. But the other fundamental issues of paying somebody or finding compromising material on somebody to get them to be his agents, that's going to be Russia's play in the long term. Less informational, I think.
Hi, everybody. We wanted to talk to you today about athletic greens. It's absolutely amazing because in the morning I get up, I take my little container, I put in 1 scoop, a little bit of warm water, and shake it up, and that's it. And I'm good for the whole day.
It gives me like mental clarity, focus, and like I'm so alert these days, whereas before I was kind of sluggish and, and just not on my A game.
I don't have to think about taking all those vitamins and supplements and stuff like that. It's all in one, because I'm really, really bad at that kind of stuff.
To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/Kremlin file. athleticgreens.com/Kremlin Kremlin File to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance.
And I've been paying a lot of attention, like we've all been paying attention to what is happening now in Mariupol, and with the steelworks plant that's there, the Azovstal. Why are the Russians? Let's say they've been bombarding that now for a few days. They're trying to get they've asked for humanitarian corridors. The Ukrainians have to get people out. Why are they so hell bent on taking that area?
Well, I think the first objective here is Putin's already declared victory in Mariupol as of 2 weeks ago. Now it's a matter of kind of realizing the rhetoric. It's kind of comical, and in a way he shows a template that he's prepared to just make hollow declarations of victory, and then let things fall out the way they might. We were talking about how much territory Russia is fighting along. And I think there's something to be said that, Russia could afford to give up some of its gains in certain areas. But the one area where it's going to want to maintain its gains, fundamentally, if anywhere, is on this land bridge between Russia and Crimea. And Mariupol is just very critical to that. It's, of the largest city on that route. And as long as there is resistance there, Russia doesn't really have a kind of secure land bridge. And the idea very well may be to secure this land bridge, call it victory, say that the special military operation is over. Of course, the Ukrainians are not going to give up, but from the Russian standpoint, they could call it over and attempt to force the Ukrainians to a compromise and try to pressure the West, probably through some additional saber rattling, threatening nuclear war or something like that, to get the Ukrainians to the bargaining table. The bottom line is that, that's misplaced. I think the Ukrainians are going to fight to regain their territory. Depending on how successful they are, they'll probably push to establish a status quo ante, the conditions before February 24th. They may even, depending on how successful they are, go all the way back to through the Donbass. And unless Putin makes another major blunder, there have been several of them in this war, I think the issue of Crimea might be tabled for another day. Leave it in its kind of special status. I think the Ukrainians would be prepared to accept that, where, in fact, Crimea goes through a process of negotiation, the idea of free and fair kind of a referendum type of thing down the road, because Ukraine doesn't want to risk fighting for it and taking losses. But that could all be undone with a huge mistake by Vladimir Putin. So hopefully he's listening to this. If Putin does declare victory in this campaign and attempts to annex Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk, that waters down the special status of that Crimea enjoys. That undermines the unique status that Crimea is Russian territory, because this is just undoes this notion that Crimea was unique in Russia's conception and Russia's status. And then it actually makes Crimea vulnerable and in play for Ukraine to win back by military means. So that would be just a huge mistake. At the best, he should consider the accepting them or recognizing them as independent or kind of independent republics or something like that without annexing them, because that would still allow Crimea to preserve its special status. Ukraine is likely to fight through everything minus Crimea in that situation.
Interesting. Do you think Putin is listening to anyone right now, or do you think he's just hell-bent on his own, drive of like, I'm not going to be defeated by the West, I'm not going to be defeated by Ukraine? Because in his head, this is, a war with the West, with Ukraine being in the middle.
I think that's certainly he thinks that this is a war with the West. But one of the signals that he absorbed relatively early, a mistake on the part of this administration, was on the when we declared there would be no NATO boots on the ground under any circumstances. that basically signaled that the U.S. And NATO would not be an obstacle to his aspirations in Ukraine. It was a terribly bad blunder. We could have kept it ambiguous and basically made it clear, when Russia was about to launch this attack, that NATO wasn't going to be involved. We didn't have to make it, almost 2 months ahead of time, and basically clarify this notion that the cost would be low. It was a bad idea. But it seems to me that I think it's clear that he doesn't have to deal with NATO boots on the ground, NATO power. He still has to fight NATO provisioning Russia, and he recognizes to a certain extent that he's, I think early, at least for much of this war, that this is probably. It's a good question. I think the question is, how does he rationalize the loss? Really, maybe fundamentally. He's not likely to rationalize it as losing at the hands of the Ukrainians. He's likely to rationalize it as losing at the hands of, covert actions, clandestine actions by NATO in Ukraine that are pulling the strings. So in that regard, I think, there is probably a growing confidence, misplaced confidence, because we're not there. And it is all Ukraine, actually, that's winning this war with some support from the West. But there's probably a growing confidence and a narrative that he is fighting the West. He's fighting NATO. But I think he does have to now. He's not. I don't think he's irrational. I think he's still kind of like a pretty competent, very opportunistic leader, and he does have to address this notion that he's been told that this is going to be an easy victory by his military for a long time, and it's not materialized. So he is more than likely going to start to seek out other sources of information, try to understand, where he may have been led astray, and probably identify some scapegoats, including the military, including Gerasimov. Maybe that's one of the reasons he went out to eastern Ukraine, so he could take the hit for this disastrous war. So I think those types of things are starting to kind of boil up.
Is there any scenario at all where you could see boil up like tea? Is there any scenario at all, Alex, where you could see, let's say, either NATO, like a combination NATO, US, well, US is in NATO, troops in Ukraine at all?
Yes. I think the longer this war goes, let's say there's a worst. I laid out different theories of how May 9th could drive this war. And one of those theories is a declaration of general mobilization. I think it's still kind of far-fetched because Russia has no gains to show to the population. It'll show weaknesses in the fact that Russian military has failed. And there's no clear prospects of, just because you do a general mobilization, you're throwing more manpower at it, but there's no clear kind of theory for success. You're just looking to potentially, through attrition, to crush Ukraine. It's unclear if you could do that. But if he were to do that, it would indicate that he's prepared to fight a months-long or years-long war. And in that scenario, I think he would likely fall back on his comfort zone, poking and prodding, seeking out vulnerabilities, seeking out fractures, seeking out ways to exploit his understanding of the Western mind, which is, I think he has a pretty good understanding, that we fall prey to our fears, hopes and our fears, and aspirations for somehow returning to normalcy. On the fear side of the equation, that in maybe even going after NATO targets, NATO safe havens, like these depots that he could warn off for additional NATO support. He might try to do this clandestinely with deniability. He could do that through cyber warfare. To me, this is kind of almost a worst case scenario. That's why I've urged this administration to think about ways to end this war quickly, to give Ukraine everything it needs to end quickly, because the most dangerous course of action doesn't unfold because we've done too much. It's because we've done too little, and we stumble into a protracted war with greater commitment and greater stake, and the potential for regime or regime survival at stake. And under those conditions, I do see different courses of action. These are all speculative, that could potentially drag us into a war. Russia does use chemical weapons. Russia accidentally destroys a nuclear power plant with radioactive plumes wafting over Europe. That's a security risk to Europe. We already are. This war has already spilled over in the economic, informational sphere, and political sphere. The only sphere it hasn't spilled over yet is military, and everything else we're in a hot war with Russia. It's only Cold War on the military plane, and the danger is that it spills over that way in a long war, and we find ourselves, reluctantly, as we did in World War I or World War II, in a war. That's why, again, it's just so pathetically short-sighted to believe that we could just somehow very, very narrowly avoid being drawn into this war in a long war scenario.
Speaking of spilling over, there has been a very, very, very similar resemblance of the same playbook, literally, but from several months leading up to Ukraine to now, in a matter of a few weeks, of Transnistria. And when I say it's identical playbook, they started with the rhetoric, protecting, Russian speakers, uprooting Nazism in Moldova. Sandu is a Nazi now, according to the Russian government. And then you saw, same players who are putting out that Romania is on the ground, their military, and that they're there to start a war. And then from there, it led immediately into, another Russian government official saying that they're going to soon recognize Transnistria as Russian territory. And then you had a series of terrorist attacks, false flag operations. Do you see it spilling over into Moldova or in Kaliningrad or Poland? And do you see Putin pulling NATO in?
Yeah.
Yep. So, it's interesting. When I wrote my article back in January, I talked about the potential for spillover. And I think certainly Putin's aspirations in succeeding in Ukraine would have carried forward to places like Moldova and Georgia, probably down the line, the locations that are least amenable to Russian power. So I think this was probably part of the initial plan. I think it's the height of idiocy to attempt a Moldova scenario when they're having such an impossible time in Ukraine, so unlikely to succeed that they would try to do another adventure in Moldova. It probably shows how out of touch they were. They still had confidence that they would be able to achieve a breakthrough. Some of this was 2 weeks ago when they were starting this more narrow campaign, and they thought that they could race through, eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. Just completely unrealistic expectations. That's all out the window because they can't even. They're barely making any progress now, and they're about to be spent. They'll run out of resources. I'll tell you that, I covered Moldova also for the National Security Council, and I'm a big fan of Maya Sandu. I met her when she was out of government still. And, I remember this vividly, this conversation in the White House in the executive office building of her saying, kind of discussing the merits of running for prime minister or president down the road. And, just having a very, very favorable impression of her. And she's definitely exceeded even the high expectations I had for her. She's turned out to be a marvelous leader. So it's very good to see her, in this difficult moment, rising to the occasion, just like Vladimir Zelensky. And in a lot of ways, the Ukrainian success will spill over into Moldovan success. Frankly, Moldova's also captured the attention of Europe, less so the United States. And it's going to carry over into a place like Belarus, which seemed like authoritarianism was locked in for the foreseeable future, as long as Lukashenko is alive. But frankly, in Ukrainian success, his position becomes quite untenable, and I think there is likely to be civil unrest. And it's possible. I could see Ukrainians wanting to settle scores too. and nurturing a Belarusian opposition in Ukraine to help overthrow Lukashenko. Completely justifiable given the fact that, Belarus was a safe haven and a belligerent in a lot of ways because they allowed the Russians to strike out from Belarus. So I think, in a lot of ways, Lukashenko is also toast in the foreseeable, probably in the next several years. So, the Russians are likely to double down like they did with this Moldova scenario before they, if they see any possibilities for success. This is why I kind of said we can't give the Russians any breathing room. They need to be soundly defeated, because any successes in the East would have been the recipe for advance towards Moldova, advance back towards Kiev. They need to be soundly defeated in order to foreclose any avenues towards victory in order to end this war. And I think we're coming around to that notion, too slowly for comfort, but we are coming around to that notion. And I thought it was too precarious a situation 2 weeks ago that we didn't do enough to help Ukraine. But I guess we didn't have to do that much to help Ukraine, because all this equipment is only now starting to flow in, and Ukraine is winning on its own. I mean, it's, we will, as the West, as the kind of like these absurd notions, the past day or so, I've been batting down these absurd articles about how central U.S. intelligence has been to Ukraine victory, or how central some javelins or stingers have been. These are marginal factors. It is the Ukrainian population, it is the Ukrainian military that has won this war with little support from the West, frankly. And I hate this idea of trying to steal credit from the because we have such pride in ourselves. We overreach that we take credit from these warriors that have defended their country and defended democracy.
You mentioned these articles, and 2 days suddenly, it comes out that we're providing intelligence. We're the ones who gave the intel to take out generals. And overnight it comes out we gave intel to take out Moskva, the ship. What was fascinating, and I checked this morning because I couldn't wait up actually to wake up to see what's happening this morning. This CNN report came out that we provided intelligence to take the ship out, Moskva, right? It took several hours for it to get into one Russian outlet, and it's very fascinating the choice that picked it up. It was Moskovsky Komsomolets, and they picked up this report. I checked, Taz didn't, Ria didn't, and then through Moskovsky Komsomolets, it went through a bunch of secondary articles, like Russian articles, like Vyachemosti and the rest. What is going on? What do you think with this? Because the RIA Novosti like picks up if Jen Psaki sneezes, it's like right away breaking. Jen Psaki just sneezed on stage.
Exactly.
Here they did not touch this, and for several weeks they have been saying that it was a fire that took down the ship, and suddenly we see this.
Well, sure, it's informed speculation, but I think there's a couple of different reasons here. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that it was lost to enemy contact. It's too much of a symbol. But more importantly, just like when the U.S. destroyed some 300 Wagner mercenaries in Deir ez-Zor, they don't want to acknowledge that it was it's good to talk about atmospherically, kind of conceptually, that the West is providing support and pulling the strings to Ukraine. But if the U.S. is directly involved in the slaughter of generals or in Moskva or destruction of the Moskva, then Russia has an obligation to respond, to defend its forces. And they do not want to get into a tangle with NATO. They are deathly afraid of this. And I think on that basis, it's not helpful to have the kind of clickbait titles that don't actually don't amount to U.S. support to make these, to go after these targets, but it certainly doesn't serve Russia's interest to inflame this kind of notion that then compels a response. And I do need to kind of explain a little bit about how this works. The U.S. provides tons of intel. It's not has not been like real time. It has not been kind of fed in real time. There's a whole process that it goes through. So therefore, it's not easily actionable because it's not real time. The U.S. will provide some information, and then the Ukrainians do a very, very good job of analyzing the information that the U.S. does provide, and then just selecting the targets and prosecuting those targets. So there was probably some assistance provided in terms of like understanding, what the Russian Navy was doing, where the command nodes were, kind of more generally. But it's again the Ukrainians using their means to triangulate exactly where these targets were, doing the reconnaissance, with the UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance conducted by like the Bayraktars, and then going after those targets. So it's well overstating the role that the U.S. played in
really
going after those targets.
Okay, I had read this quote, and Alex, I wanted what your thoughts on this. Okay, armies reflect the qualities of the societies from which they emerge. Russia's state rests on corruption, lies, lawlessness, and coercion. Now, I think that, when I read this and it resonated, and I said, okay, I think it's one of the reasons why Russia will lose this war and why Ukraine will prevail. Would you agree?
Yeah. First of all, who made that quote? Because this is the same, a much better way of putting it than I did.
I found it in the article. I will find it. Yeah.
I've been saying this for. Yeah, it's basically the same notion that the barbarism reflects the society. The barbarism reflects the values of authoritarianism, and that the military reflects the same kind of societal values, in corruption, endemic corruption, leading to kind of a hollow force with minimal capabilities. I completely agree with that notion.
I will.
If you find it, I'd be curious to know who it is, and maybe I'll offer that I'll attribute the quote to somebody. But that's the same thing that I've been saying for some time, that the Russians are likely to lose on this basis, and that's why I think this is so important for geopolitics at large. That then China has to reflect on their real capabilities. Can they face off against Taiwan that's going to resist with all means? Can they conduct a successful amphibious attack and things of that nature? And it's a chilling effect on authoritarianism and what authoritarianism can accomplish, because they see reflections of themselves in Russian power, Russian successes, but also Russian failures. And I think that's one of the major stories of Ukraine winning this war is it really does push back on this notion, this alternative vision that China has been trying to cast about managed democracy or kind of Chinese forms of capitalism and stuff like that. It chose it to be weak.
Yeah, that's actually really funny, because I hate quote, have made jokes with people who I know who used to deal in Russia and now have fled. They robbed so much from every contract that, I don't want to test it out, but I'm like, if they send even say they said Putin, says that's a launch a missile to U.S., a nuclear missile. I'm like, will that even come to us, or will it go back into Siberia? Because they don't maintain anything.
We're laughing.
For every contract. For every contract, this is what they've been doing for decades. They're robbing it. And it's like you see even Victory Day Parade. I'm actually going to retweet. Every year, I monitor their Victory Day Parade. Every year, no fail. Last year, now this is Victory Day Parade.
Right.
The biggest, thing.
That's it.
Last year, a tank is going, it starts smoking. How embarrassing. The year before, a tank falls off in the middle, like a huge crowd falls off the flatbed and just rolls over. And I'm like, there you go.
Yikes.
Victory Day Parade.
Yikes.
Yeah, it is.
It's showing its belly like a dog does. Rolls over,
I'm
shows its
gonna
belly.
send you that because
You
it
did
is
it.
so funny. And I'm like, and I saw someone.
Yeah,
I saw
someone
it.
saw someone.
There's a picture of me at one point sitting in the Victory Day parade. I guess it was in like 2014 or something like that. In those the dais and the stands, kind of observing it in my official capacity. As an
wow. And what was your feeling? What did you feel while you were watching all of this? Like what observations can you give to us?
It was quite the show. Okay. It looked very impressive. It was quite the show. It looked very impressive. It was a good display of Russian power, but it also was. It's a Potemkin army.
It's a propaganda. Yeah, it's a propaganda moment. So it's a show.
It is a propaganda thing. I mean, yeah.
It's a show.
They want to reflect, and then when they actually, and to my final question on this, what was Putin thinking? Because Russia never, I mean,
no, I know
Russia never, I know his, grandiose, illusions of restoring the Soviet Union and this and that.
Yeah.
But
I think I have pretty good feel.
What was he thinking? Russia in like 4 decades has never, Russia, like with everything we're saying, they are good to project more than they actually can accomplish. So they're very successful when it takes, they have to like grab territories, when they have to, conduct operations, destabilizing, disinformation operations. They're excellent with that. But what was he thinking trying to take over the second largest country in Europe, thinking that he's going to hold on to it to succeed without
second largest,
largest country in Europe, holding on to the territory, thinking he's going to succeed without ever even testing this military, because he's only tested this military in little spaces, never like in a full-blown takeover.
Well, there are two elements here. I think. Actually, maybe three major elements. The first is an absolute need to take action before it's too late. Ukraine was slipping through Russia's fingers. It couldn't afford to just let Ukraine slip through its fingers, based on the fact that Ukraine, as a viable, prosperous, democratic nation, somewhere down the road, even kind of far off, would present, kind of very challenging ideological situation for Russia and the Russians that have a deep sense of chauvinism and of Russian power. And the question is, like, why can't we enjoy that prosperity also? And Ukraine was getting increasingly more capable of defending itself. The other one is opportunity. He had a deeply misplaced notion based on Russian chauvinism of Russian power versus Ukrainian power. Ukrainian power. We're talking about Ukrainian power now. Ukraine is a great power, a great regional power.
Right?
It's pretty amazing, but it is a great regional power. And then the other aspect of this that was a big mistake was, believing that over the course of 22 years in power, that there was an enormous vulnerability emanating from the West. That the West and the U.S. were not as strong as they seemed. That the U.S. was distracted, divided. It's not coincidental that this war in earnest started to get planned just weeks after January 6th and Trump's efforts to steal an election. The U.S. looked terribly weak. The divide between the U.S. and NATO seemed vast also, based on the damage of Donald Trump. It seemed clear to him, mistakenly so, that the Republican Party was not going to impose a cost. So all these different pieces kind of added up to this notion that he could get away with this. The Ukrainians were not going to put up a fight. The West was not going to impose costs. It was quite logical. And from his perspective, he's seen nothing but kind of weakness in the face of his strength, his shows of force, whether that's the West looking the other way to undemocratic actions in his first term in the early 2000s, where we kind of wanted a good relationship. This was under the Bush administration, or not suffering any consequences for trying to steal the election resulting in an orange revolution under the Bush administration. Under Obama, a reset just, like months after
Invasion.
Orange Revolution, relatively modest costs to the war in 2014, assassination attempts, chemical weapons, poisoning of adversaries, or nuclear weapons, poisoning of adversaries, or assassination attempts, or bounties on U.S. soldiers, or attempting to steal or interference in the 2016 election. All of this amounted to a theory that he could get away with it, that the U.S. would kind of look the other way. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was the Ukrainians' ability to resist Ukrainian leadership and the public in both Europe and the United States rallying around the Ukraine that undid a lot of those theories of success. And the American population came out early and in force behind the Ukrainian people and demanded that the administration do more, to the point where, folks on the right that President Trump had captured had to do a 180-degree reversal of their positions on who the bad guys and the good guys were. So I think, again, a lot of his actions were logical. He was reading kind of relatively superficial indicators of success, without having a kind of a deeper analysis of how things were likely to fall out, and that democracy would rally for democracy.
I said it since January. I am convinced that this is the end of him. Not short term. I don't think we'll see then, hopefully. But I'm convinced he's not going to survive this. He overstepped his reach, and
that's it.
I just don't see.
Right.
I see a Putin-free Russia coming.
Yeah. Well, let's say, he was wrong. Thank goodness. Okay. That he was wrong. And Alex, I'm going to remind everybody, because here, right? The title of your book is Here, Right Matters. Now it's an American story, but I hope that one day you're also going to write the Ukrainian story. Okay. As well. Okay. So great.
Well, I am writing the Ukrainian story.
That's
my dissertation is on for Johns Hopkins. SICE is on U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine.
Fantastic.
Since 1991. I'm going to defend it relatively shortly. I've written the first half of it already.
Amazing.
I just there's this war that's been preventing me from finishing it up, but I'll find some time to do that.
So thank you, Alex. Okay, for coming by.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and please visit our website, kremlinfile.com. This is a Bunker Crew Media production, hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Camarra, with executive producers Marley Clements, Jack Bryan, Grant DeSimone, Ben Brett, and Jordy Mycelis of Midas Media, with associate producers Ruby Frankel and Sarah Metz. Theme music by Oreste Camarra. Sound editing and mixing by Joy Ellett. Subscribe to Kremlin File wherever you listen to podcasts.